And in the days to come, Jasmine Crockett would keep walking into hearings, casting votes, giving speeches. She would still be questioned, still be challenged, still carry the weight of speaking not just truth, but uncomfortable truth. Not because it was easy, not because it was popular, but because somewhere out there was a girl named Maya, and maybe a dozen others, and maybe 1,000 more. And when they asked themselves what power looked like, Jasmine wanted them to remember not the fire, but the stillness behind it, the calm, clear voice that didn't back down, the woman who didn't need to shout to be heard. As the screen fades to black, the narrator's voice enters, not loud but certain. In a world of noise, courage isn't just about volume, it's about clarity. And maybe, just maybe, that's where real change begins. Not in the chambers of power, but in the quiet spaces between generations. In a letter folded by small hands. In a classroom debate where no one wins, but everyone learns. In the willingness to carry pain forward, not as a burden, but as a torch. Jasmine Crockett didn't set out to become a symbol. She became one by refusing to lie for the comfort of others. Her story is not perfect. It's not clean, or easy to package, or free from contradiction. But that's what makes it powerful, because the truth has never needed to be polished to be real. It just needs to be spoken. And for those watching, whether from a classroom desk, a barbershop chair, or the back pew of a quiet church, the message remains. Your voice matters. Your memory matters. And when the moment comes, your silence will matter just as much. The fight for justice is not only waged in the loudest places. Sometimes it happens when you speak truth across a room that's already decided who they think you are, and you speak anyway. Let it be known, the purpose of this story is not to demonize or deify, but to illuminate the cost of speaking up when silence is safer. While this work is grounded in real events and public figures, it is a creative, transformative reflection, blending fact, interpretation, and narrative under the principles of fair use. It is offered not as political gospel, but as a mirror, to reflect the tensions we carry, the truths we avoid, and the possibilities that rise when courage refuses to whisper. Because in the end, it's not about going viral, it's about standing so clear in your truth that even history cannot ignore your echo. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive. The judge leaned back ever so slightly, studying her again. Not with anger, but with something more dangerous. Quiet irritation. Like she had broken a rule unspoken, not just one written. He tapped his gavel once more. Very well. You are fined $200 for violating courtroom dress protocol. Bailiff, note that. And just like that, the fire had been lit. No one applauded, no one shouted. But there were murmurs. A quiet wow slipped from the back row. Jasmine didn't argue, didn't defend. She opened her notebook, began writing, as if the fine was just another note in a long list of moments she'd anticipated and prepared for. And though the hearing continued, something fundamental had changed. Eyes no longer watched the lawyers. They watched her. The woman with the cross, the woman who didn't speak up, but never backed down. And no one in that room, not even Judge Driscoll, had the faintest idea that the person they tried to silence was about to become the one voice they couldn't ignore. That necklace, simple, gold, and gracefully aged, was never meant to start a courtroom battle. But for Jasmine, it had never been just jewelry. Long before the gavel struck that morning, before the judge's clipped voice filled the room with silence, before anyone whispered her name like a question or stared like a warning, that cross had already fought its share of wars. Worn by a woman named Elsie Redmond, born in 1930 in Ruston, Louisiana, the cross had first rested against skin that knew what it meant to walk 5 miles just to vote, only to be turned away. Skin that had once been burned by Southern sun while picking cotton under Jim Crow laws, and later bruised by baton handles wielded during the protests of 1964. Elsie was Jasmine's grandmother, but more than that, she was her compass, The woman who taught her to stand still when others trembled and speak softly even when the world demanded she scream. Jasmine remembered it vividly. Sunday mornings in a small red brick church outside Houston, the stained glass windows catching fire as dawn poured through, casting streaks of gold on pews filled with tired but stubborn believers. Elsie sat on the second row, always wearing that same necklace. Never flashy, never changed. When Jasmine was just 8 years old, she asked, "Why don't you ever take it off?" Elsie had smiled with a kind of weariness only time could teach. "Because, child," she said, "some days you don't have words, but you still gotta speak." Jasmine hadn't understood then, but she does now. That cross had been passed down on her law school graduation day, not wrapped in a box, but simply slipped into her hand by her mother, along with a folded note that read, "It's yours now. Don't let them forget we were here too." She wore it the day she took her bar exam, wore it again during her first court appearance defending a woman evicted unjustly by a corporate landlord. She wore it when she walked into Congress for the first time, facing a chamber where very few looked like her, and even fewer listened to voices that did. That necklace became her thread, connecting memory to mission, silence to stance. But in that Dallas courtroom, it was suddenly something else entirely, a battleground, a trigger, a symbol no longer quietly sacred, but now loudly politicized. Because in America, still today, symbols aren't just personal, they're provocative. They draw lines, raise eyebrows, invite scrutiny. A gold cross, a hijab, a yarmulke, a raised fist, a kneel during an anthem. All of them, at one time or another, have been called disruptive. And disruption, in the eyes of the powerful, is rarely welcome, especially when it comes in silence and wrapped in grace. What Jasmine understood, and what Judge Driscoll didn't, is that the battle over symbols has never been about the object itself. It's about what it threatens to remind us. A cross in that courtroom wasn't just metal, it was memory. It was Elsie Redmond standing in a voting line that never moved. It was her mother being told her accent made her sound unprofessional. It was every woman who was told to take off her earrings, to straighten her hair, to smile more, to quiet down, to shrink herself into something the system could tolerate. It was every moment Jasmine had been told, "You don't belong here." And every moment she replied, not with defiance, but with presence. And so when she refused to remove it, she wasn't defying the judge. She was honoring the generations that had refused to disappear. That necklace wasn't there to speak for her. It was there to remind her she was never speaking alone. But the courtroom didn't know that yet. All they saw was a gold cross. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was how much power one symbol could carry when wrapped in the stillness of a woman who had no intention of backing down. The proceedings resumed, but the air in the courtroom had shifted. Slightly, subtly, but unmistakably. Words from the attorneys still filled the space. Legal terms echoed predictably off polished wood and aging stone. But for many in the gallery, the true center of gravity had moved. It no longer sat behind the plaintiff's table or wore a judge's robe. It sat quietly in the front row, pen scratching against paper in a rhythm all her own. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't glance around, didn't perform. She simply wrote, with the steady hand of someone who had studied too much truth to be rattled by a $200 fine. She wasn't doodling, she wasn't taking casual notes. What she was writing, no one could see, but the intensity in her expression said it mattered. She drew lines, circled passages, underlined details. Her lips never moved, but her eyes absorbed everything. Every objection, every counterpoint, every time the defense tried to chip away at the humanity of the man sitting at the plaintiff's table. And it was then, just after the fifth mention of prior record and the second insinuation that maybe Cecil Monroe hadn't been entirely cooperative, that a voice, quiet as breath, slipped through the space between seats. "That's her," someone whispered. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even meant to travel far. But it didn't need to. Like the first note in a forgotten song, it resonated. The man who had whispered it was Cecil Monroe himself. He hadn't raised his voice. His lips barely moved. But the moment he said it, the moment he recognized her, the courtroom began to see her differently. Cecil turned ever so slightly in his chair, squinting with the effort of memory. "That's Jasmine Crockett," he murmured to Lauren Gates, the young attorney seated beside him. "The Congresswoman." His voice was lined with both curiosity and something deeper. Hope. Lauren blinked, surprised. "Didn't expect her here either," she replied under her breath. But now she was watching Jasmine too. And just like that, attention shifted. Not all at once, but gradually, inevitably. Eyes wandered from the judge's bench to the woman in black. Reporters in the back began rechecking their notes. Two law students exchanged looks. One pulled up her phone under the bench, covertly searching the name. Jasmine Crockett courtroom cross fine. What had been a fine for violating dress protocol was quickly becoming something else. A question, a symbol, a signal. It wasn't just the necklace anymore. It was the woman wearing it. And what made it all the more captivating, what made people lean in just slightly without realizing it, was that Jasmine didn't seem to care whether they looked or not. She didn't acknowledge the glances. She didn't straighten her spine or adjust her expression for effect. She simply kept writing, her face calm, her demeanor unchanging, as if the rising ripple around her belonged to someone else. That stillness, that quiet certainty, was louder than any argument being made inside the well of the court. Some people command attention by demanding it. Jasmine commanded attention by ignoring it. And in a room full of voices raised in technical debate, hers was the one voice that hadn't spoken. And still, somehow, everyone was now waiting to hear what it might say. Judge Driscoll hadn't noticed the shift yet. Not fully. His attention was still on the statements being made, on the evidence introduced, on the ticking of minutes. But others had. The gallery wasn't listening the same way anymore. The jurors weren't shifting in their seats out of boredom. They were watching Jasmine between testimonies, their eyes returning to her the way one checks a clock, sensing that something is coming, but not knowing when. The feeling in the courtroom was no longer just legal tension. It had become emotional suspense, because now the question lingering in everyone's mind wasn't whether the plaintiff would win or if the defense would prevail. It was this: why is Jasmine Crockett really here? And what's she going to do next? The courtroom was running like clockwork, or so it seemed. Lauren Gates, young, diligent, fiercely prepared, stood steady before the jury, her notes fanned out meticulously across the table, her voice measured, calm, and deliberate. She had spent months on this case, every affidavit memorized, every inconsistency in the prison logs flagged, every medical report triple-checked. Her words came with quiet authority, the kind that didn't demand respect, but earned it slowly, syllable by syllable. "Mr. Monroe was pulled from his cell without warning," she said, her southern drawl steady, "and sustained injuries that were not only preventable, they were the result of deliberate force." She moved to the next page in her folder, about to show the intake photo that displayed bruising on Cecil's ribs. But then she stopped. No one noticed it immediately. Her hand hovered just a second too long over the document. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Then a blink, slower than it should have been. Her balance shifted almost imperceptibly. She swayed, knees stiff, eyes glassy. In the front row, Jasmine looked up instantly, pen frozen mid-stroke. Something was off, deeply off. The folder slipped first, papers scattering like leaves across the floor. Then Lauren's knees gave way, and her body followed. She didn't crumple. She collapsed, hard, her shoulders striking the edge of the plaintiff's table, before thudding onto the wooden floor, with a dull finality that made even the ceiling fan seem to pause. The room erupted. Gasps tore through the gallery. Chairs scraped backward. A woman in the second row cried out, hand clutched over her mouth. Cecil Monroe stood up instinctively, his mouth open, trembling, unsure whether to run to her or back away. The judge slammed his gavel once, not to restore order, but in reflex, a useless gesture against the chaos unfolding. "Get medical," someone shouted. "She's not breathing right." The bailiff rushed forward. A man from the audience, possibly a nurse, leaped the barrier without waiting for permission, already kneeling at Lauren's side. "She's got a pulse," he said quickly. "But it's faint." He checked her breathing, rolled her gently onto her side. Jasmine was there too, moving before she even realized it, already crouched, helping to gather Lauren's hair out of her face, whispering something soft and steady near her ear, though no one could hear the words. Within minutes, the shrill urgency of paramedic sirens pierced the tense silence from outside. The double doors burst open. Two EMTs rushed in with a stretcher, cutting through the thick energy of the room like a blade through fabric. Jasmine stood aside to let them work, but her eyes never left Lauren's pale face. The young attorney's brow was clammy, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. They loaded her gently onto the gurney, voices low but efficient. One paramedic made a quick note. Blood pressure erratic, heart rate elevated. Possible exhaustion. Could be something more. Judge Driscoll stood now, rubbing his temples, face unreadable. This court will recess until further notice, he announced, his voice tighter than usual, not out of irritation, but discomfort. Counsel for the plaintiff is indisposed. We will need to reschedule once her condition stabilizes. But not everyone in the courtroom was ready to stand down. No, Cecil said suddenly, loud enough to silence even the paramedics for a moment. We can't wait again. We ain't got time for this. His voice cracked, not with anger, but desperation. She's the only one who listened to me. I can't find another lawyer. I can't afford to. He turned, eyes scanning the courtroom, wild with urgency, then landing on Jasmine like a man finding a lighthouse in a storm. You can, right? He asked. You a lawyer, ain't you? And just like that, the question everyone had been circling without daring to ask was spoken aloud. Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet. She simply stood there, frozen between instinct and decision, between presence and power. The room held its breath, and in that long moment between one woman falling and another rising, the silence in the courtroom screamed louder than any gavel ever could. The doors hadn't even closed behind the paramedics when Cecil Monroe stood up, trembling with something deeper than fear, something closer to panic. His tie, slightly askew, trembled against his chest as he looked around the courtroom, first at the empty chair where his attorney had just sat, then at the judge who was already gathering his notes to leave the bench. Your Honor, Cecil said, voice shaking, unsure if he even had the right to speak. We can't wait. Judge Driscoll looked up, surprised. Mr. Monroe, this court is adjourned until... No, Cecil interrupted, his voice cracking. I don't have time. I don't got no more money for another lawyer. I can't do this all over again. That woman, Lauren, she knew my story. She believed me. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the courtroom, as if searching for something that could anchor him. And then he saw her. His eyes met Jasmine's, not with entitlement, but with desperate recognition. You, he said, pointing gently, as if afraid the gesture might be too much. You're a lawyer, ain't you? The room fell still again. Not the quiet of order, but the quiet of something sacred hanging in the balance. Jasmine stood motionless, her hands resting on the closed leather notebook in front of her. Her jaw clenched, then relaxed. Her gaze didn't flinch, but she didn't respond right away either. I'm just here in a personal capacity, she said finally, her voice low, even. I'm not part of this case. But you could be, Cecil said, his voice rising, not in anger, but in that pleading tone of someone who has nothing left to lose. You've been sitting here. You've seen it all. You heard every word. You know what they're trying to do. He paused, breathing uneven. Please, I can't fight this alone. And that was the moment when all the weight she thought she'd left outside, her title, her past, her grandmother's prayers, the law school debt, the long nights reading cases by lamplight, the marches she'd watched from the edge of the crowd as a child, all of it came back, full force. The courtroom hadn't asked her to rise. The system hadn't invited her in, but justice. Justice was calling, and justice never checks credentials before it cries for help. Judge Driscoll cleared his throat. His tone was drier now, more measured. Miss Crockett, he said, eyes narrowing, are you licensed to practice in the state of Texas? There was no heat in his voice, just calculation. Jasmine nodded once. I am. And, he continued, are you willing to assume representation of the plaintiff on record? Another pause, another breath. Jasmine turned to look at Cecil, who stood there, frayed, vulnerable, hopeful. She turned back to the judge. "I'd need a moment to review the file," she said. "You'll have 10 minutes," the judge replied, "but I'll allow it." Gasps, soft but real, rippled through the room. The bailiff's pen froze mid-motion. A reporter in the back immediately began typing into her phone. Even the jury, now technically excused, shifted slightly in their seats, because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. This wasn't just an observer agreeing to help. This wasn't just a lawyer stepping into a case. This was a moment when history cracked open wide enough for one person to step through. A moment when silence had asked for help and someone had said yes. Jasmine moved without hesitation. She walked past the gallery and slipped into Lauren's vacant seat, gently brushing aside the remaining papers. She didn't ask for help. She didn't look back. She just opened the file, flipped to the most recent depositions, and began to read with the cold precision of someone who hadn't planned for this, but had unknowingly prepared for it all her life. Duty had called, and this time it hadn't waited for permission. Jasmine's fingers moved with a kind of mechanical grace, flipping each page with precision, not haste. Her eyes swept over every word, every red-marked sentence, every post-it tab Lauren had so meticulously prepared. To an outsider, she may have looked calm, composed, maybe even cold, but anyone who had ever fought for something that mattered, really mattered, could see the truth written across her body language. This was focus under fire. She wasn't reviewing a case file. She was mapping a battlefield, every detail a landmine or lifeline. To her right, Cecil sat frozen, eyes on her hands as they moved, lips slightly parted, unsure whether to breathe or pray. Across the aisle, Daniel Sturgis leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, amusement dancing in his eyes. He had the confidence of a man who had argued 100 cases and lost only a few. Never to someone who had entered the courtroom as a spectator. To him, Jasmine was a late-game substitution, a procedural delay, maybe even a footnote. His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, more of a smirk, when he whispered to his paralegal, "10 minutes won't make her a lawyer." But Jasmine wasn't listening to him. She wasn't even aware of the sideways glances, the whispered bets from the gallery, or the quick texts being fired off by court reporters. She was somewhere deeper, somewhere far behind her eyes, drawing not just from the words on paper, but from years spent preparing for moments just like this, even when she didn't know she was preparing for them. She remembered her first pro bono case, a tenant named Darlene who'd been evicted without cause while recovering from breast cancer. Jasmine had shown up to court with a cheap gray blazer and a legal pad full of handwritten arguments. She lost that case, badly. The judge didn't even look up from his notes when he dismissed it. Jasmine had gone home that night, sat on the edge of her mattress on the floor, and stared at the necklace her grandmother had left her. "It's not about the win," she whispered to herself. "It's about showing up." There had been others. The black father falsely accused of stealing from a department store. The teenage girl suspended for wearing a shirt that showed her natural hair. The immigrant mother threatened with deportation after reporting wage theft. Jasmine hadn't won every case. In fact, for a long time, she lost more than she won. But each one sharpened her, toughened her, taught her how to find the story in the mess, the thread of truth in a knot of confusion. And it taught her something Sturgis would never understand. You don't have to be expected to be prepared. Back in the present, she circled 3 sentences, underlined 2 witness statements, and made a note on the margin. Tight handwriting, barely slanted. She flipped to the intake photo, then to the nurse's delayed checkup form. Her pen moved again. One juror glanced over, not at the evidence, but at her face. It wasn't just what she was writing. It was how she was writing. Confident, fast, fluid, as if her brain was downloading every contradiction, every lapse in procedure, and translating it into a story that could hold up in front of a jury. The bailiff cleared his throat, gently announcing that her 10 minutes were up. Jasmine looked up, not startled, but fully present. She closed the folder with care, turned toward the bench, and nodded once. "I'm ready to proceed." Across the courtroom, Sturgis blinked, just once. The smirk didn't fade entirely, but it twitched, as if something small, almost imperceptible, had changed. And for the first time, someone in the gallery whispered something new. He's not ready. Because while the storm had rattled the courtroom, Jasmine Crockett had been in the eye of it the whole time, calm, clear, and about to strike. The courtroom hadn't fully settled when Jasmine Crockett stood. No rustle of robes, no dramatic clearing of the throat, no practiced glance at the jury, just movement, calm, precise, and purposeful. She rose not like someone seeking attention, but like someone stepping into responsibility that had already been waiting for her. The chatter died before it began. Even the bailiff straightened instinctively, as if something sacred had just begun, and he didn't want to be the one to interrupt it. Jasmine didn't walk toward the podium like she was claiming space. She walked like she belonged there, like the room had finally remembered its true center. She turned to face the jury, and her first words were not loud, but they carried weight. "This isn't a misunderstanding," she said. "It's a violation." 6 words. That was all it took. The gallery leaned in. The jury blinked in unison. The judge paused, his pen hovering midair. Sturgis folded his arms tighter across his chest, as if suddenly aware of the shift in air pressure. Jasmine didn't pause. Her voice was even, unshaken, devoid of theatrical flair. But each word landed like a verdict. She described in clear detail the facts. A clerical error that led to the unlawful incarceration of Cecil Monroe, a 67-year-old veteran, a man with a limp, a man with nerve damage from previous surgeries, a man who had never resisted, never raised his voice, never raised a hand. And yet, a man who left Ashland Correctional with fractured ribs, a bruised face, and permanent nerve damage in his left forearm. She showed the intake form dated January 11th, the day before the assault, where the system had already marked him for release. He was no longer supposed to be there, she said, but instead of going home, he was pulled from his cell, slammed into a wall, and left on the concrete like a broken item in a forgotten warehouse. Her tone never changed, not once, but that was what made it so impossible to ignore. There was no rage, no tears, no performance, just truth, surgical, measured, undeniable. She tapped the evidence screen. The grainy black and white photos appeared one by one. Intake paperwork, medical reports, a time-stamped internal memo showing correctional staff entering Monroe's cell over an hour before their shift began. "This wasn't an accident," Jasmine said. "It wasn't routine, and it certainly wasn't justified." The jury didn't nod. They didn't react openly, but something had shifted. One juror crossed her arms tighter, as if holding herself together. Another adjusted his glasses, blinked twice, and didn't look away. It wasn't just the content of Jasmine's words, it was the clarity, like someone finally turning on a light in a room that had always been dim. "This case is not about making an example," she continued. "It's about making it right." She gestured back toward Monroe, who sat still, hands folded in his lap, staring not at Jasmine, but at the floor. Like even now, he couldn't quite believe someone was finally saying these things aloud. "My client isn't asking for sympathy," Jasmine said. "He's asking for recognition, that what happened to him wasn't unfortunate, it was unconstitutional." She rested her hand gently on the evidence table for a moment, letting the silence speak. Then she looked at the jury, not as a performer seeking validation, but as a woman who had carried the truth into the room and laid it bare for them to see. And for a breathless, suspended second, the courtroom simply stayed still, wrapped not in spectacle, but in the gravity of one voice, speaking when it mattered most. When Jasmine returned to her seat, the courtroom held its breath just long enough for Daniel Sturgis to seize it. He stood slowly, adjusted his jacket cuff with a practiced flick, then strode toward the jury box with the poise of someone who believed they were still firmly in control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice butter smooth, "we're not here to debate emotion. We're here to examine evidence." His tone wasn't arrogant, not outright, but coated in that quiet patronization that disguises itself as reason. "And the evidence," he continued, "tells us that memory can be flawed, that pain is subjective, and that sometimes what feels unjust is simply misunderstood." He clicked the remote and replaced Jasmine's documents with a new image, a photo of Cecil Monroe exiting the prison on the day of his release. Here we see Mr. Monroe walking without assistance. No wheelchair, no visible trauma, no emergency medical escort. He turned to the jury, brows raised. Does this look like someone who just suffered a violent attack? The strategy was clear. Minimize, deflect, confuse. He moved swiftly from the photo to Monroe's personal history. Let's be transparent, he said. Mr. Monroe has a documented altercation from 1989. He was intoxicated, involved in a bar fight. That speaks to potential pre-existing conditions. Perhaps these injuries didn't all come from this alleged incident. Cecil stiffened visibly. Jasmine narrowed her eyes but said nothing. Yet, Sturgis wasn't finished. You'll also hear from a witness, he said, pacing now, like a lecturer with a captive audience. A fellow inmate. But ask yourselves, how credible is a man currently serving time for perjury? He let the words linger, poisonous and composed. Desperation makes people say anything. He returned to his table like a man who believed he had just unraveled the case, but Jasmine was already standing. Permission to respond, she said calmly. Driscoll nodded. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't glare. She simply walked to the screen and tapped once. The image Sturgis had shown, Monroe exiting the facility, returned. Jasmine zoomed in on the timestamp. This photo, she said, was taken nearly 14 hours after the assault, and the checkup form filed by the attending nurse, time-stamped 6 hours after that. She turned slowly to the jury. So yes, you see Mr. Monroe walking, but what you don't see are the hours he spent in pain before anyone examined him. She clicked again. A diagram appeared, simple but meticulous. A timeline. Jasmine pointed. Assault occurred approximately 4:15 a.m. Medical attention not recorded until 8:47 p.m. That's over 16 hours where injuries went unassessed and untreated. Then came another click, another diagram. As for the witness, she continued, yes, he has a conviction for perjury, but what Mr. Sturgis failed to mention is that this man, Jerome King, came forward voluntarily. He wasn't offered a deal, no sentence reduction. He had nothing to gain by speaking, and his statement included details. Guard rotation schedules, entry logs that he had no access to, information that matched internal records. There was no smugness in her delivery, no pride, just unshakable clarity. Then she paused, let the room settle into her silence. Let's talk plainly, she said, because this case isn't just about facts, it's about frames, about how easily a black man's history becomes a weapon, about how before we even examine the bruises, we're asked to rejudge the past, about how long before we put anyone on trial, we've already put his body, his memory, his worth under suspicion. Her words didn't rise, but their weight did. She looked directly at Sturgis. You're not just cross-examining facts, you're cross-examining existence. And for the first time, Sturgis had no reply. Jasmine let the silence hang for just a beat longer than expected, long enough to let the final note of her challenge to Sturgis settle into the wood-paneled walls, long enough for the jurors to shift in their seats and for Judge Driscoll to glance, just briefly, over the rim of his glasses. Then she turned back to the screen and tapped it once. A new slide appeared. The words were clear, centered, deliberate. Hope v. Pelzer, 536 U.S., 730, 2002. In this case, she began, a prison guard in Alabama handcuffed an inmate to a hitching post outside in the sun for 7 hours. No water, no shade, no bathroom breaks. Her voice was steady, quiet, but there was a rhythm to it now, the kind that didn't need volume to build momentum. The state argued it wasn't protocol, but also not cruel, because the man wasn't seriously injured. She paused, then turned to the jury. The Supreme Court disagreed. Click. Hudson versus McMillian, 503 U.S. 1, 1992. In this one, a man in Louisiana was beaten by guards. He suffered cuts, bruises, loosened teeth. The Fifth Circuit said those injuries weren't grave enough to qualify as cruel and unusual punishment. Her eyes moved slowly across the jurors' faces. But the High Court again disagreed, because brutality doesn't require broken bones, only intent. The courtroom was utterly still now. Even Sturgis had stopped tapping his pen. These rulings weren't just legal victories, Jasmine continued. They were declarations. That in the United States, pain is not theoretical, it's constitutional. That the Eighth Amendment isn't reserved for the worst offenses or the clearest wounds. It protects human dignity, always. She clicked again. The screen showed Monroe's medical intake report. Then his photo, black and white, grainy but unmistakable. The bruises across his cheek, the swelling under his eye, the uneven angle of his arm in the sling. You don't need a law degree to see what happened here, she said. You need eyes. You need honesty. And you need a willingness to believe that a mistake on paper should never become violence in flesh. One juror leaned forward slightly, elbows now resting on his knees. Another pinched the bridge of her nose, then looked up again, her expression no longer neutral, but sharp with attention. Even Judge Driscoll, who had been slouched slightly before, now sat more upright, both elbows on the bench, his fingers laced together in front of his lips. Jasmine stepped to the side of the screen, letting the images linger behind her like witnesses. The law does not exist in a vacuum, she said. It exists to serve people, to correct, to protect, to restrain those in power when that power is misused. If we let this pass as a clerical oversight, if we treat fractured ribs like paperwork errors, then we are not defending justice. We are dismantling it. She turned again to the jury, softer now. This man was supposed to go home. Instead, he was punished for being invisible, for being forgotten, for being alone. Then she turned to Monroe. Except he's not alone anymore. And with that, Jasmine walked calmly back to her seat, closed her folder gently, and folded her hands. She didn't look up. She didn't wait for applause or acknowledgement. She had given them the truth, wrapped in law, grounded in history, and elevated by the one thing no defense could discredit: her belief that justice was still possible if someone was brave enough to demand it. There was a pause, a silence not forced but felt, after Jasmine finished laying out the legal architecture of her argument. Her case was solid, fortified with precedent and precise logic, but something in her eyes suggested that she wasn't finished. She stood once more, but this time she didn't move toward the screen. She didn't call a new witness or hold up another diagram. Instead, she simply turned to the jury, rested her hand gently against the gold cross around her neck, and held it there for a moment. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't meant to draw gasps or headlines. But the room responded anyway, with stillness, with respect, with something close to reverence. "This," she said softly, "was my grandmother's." The words dropped like stones into a still pond, subtle but resonant. She let them sit before continuing. Her name was Elsie Redmond. She was born in Ruston, Louisiana, in 1930. She didn't get to vote until she was nearly 40, not because she didn't want to, but because every time she tried, there was a test, a tax, a sheriff's deputy standing just close enough to make her feel small. Jasmine's voice never wavered, but her tone had changed. Less courtroom cadence, more confession, more memory. She wore this cross to church, to protests, to funerals, to doctor's appointments she had to walk 5 miles to reach because no one in town would treat her. She looked at the jury again. She wore it when she was told she wasn't welcome. She wore it when silence was the safest thing to wear. The gallery didn't shift, didn't blink. It was as if time itself had bowed its head for just a moment. Jasmine lowered her hand from the necklace, but not the story. When she gave it to my mother, she said, "It won't shield you, but it'll remind you who you are." And when my mother passed it down to me, on the day I passed the bar, she said, "Wear it when they tell you to shrink, when they tell you to wait your turn, when they tell you that justice is a room you don't belong in." She let the pause breathe again before continuing. "So I wear it, not to provoke, not to make a statement. I wear it because it anchors me to women who survived things that never made it into court transcripts." Then her voice sharpened, not in volume, but in precision. "This morning I was fined $200 for wearing this necklace in view of the jury. I was told it might interfere with objectivity, that it might send the wrong message." Now her gaze swept the room, not just the jury, but the gallery, the defense table, even the judge. "But if you're afraid of a necklace," she said quietly, "maybe it's not the symbol that's threatening." A hush spread wider, heavier. Jasmine wasn't trying to convert the courtroom. She wasn't even trying to defend herself. She was telling the truth, the kind that doesn't need footnotes or legal citations, only memory. She didn't need them to agree. She needed them to understand. She took a breath, then softened. I didn't come here to make a point. I came here to witness, to honor a man who was ignored, and a system that too often asked people like him to prove they're worth protecting. And with that, she stepped back. No flourish, no closing line. Just a quiet return to her chair, the necklace still resting against her collarbone. Unmoved, untouched, and now unforgettable. Jasmine hadn't intended to blur the line between law and belief that day. But when she sat down, her words still echoing in the high-ceiling courtroom, that line was already beginning to dissolve. The judge hadn't responded. Sturgis had no immediate rebuttal. Even the reporters in the gallery weren't sure whether they were witnessing an argument or a reckoning. What Jasmine had done, deliberately or not, was tear down a wall that most institutions prefer to keep intact. And she did it not with a slogan, not with defiance, but with the simplest truth of all. Faith and law aren't enemies. They're misunderstood. That sentence didn't land with thunder. It landed with echo. And echo, in the age of digital eyes and ears, is often louder than thunder. Someone sitting near the back of the gallery, a young law intern, maybe a journalist, had recorded the moment on their phone. The camera was shaky. The audio had courtroom rustle. But the image was clear enough to see Jasmine touch the necklace and speak her grandmother's name. That clip, just 57 seconds long, hit the internet before the court even recessed for lunch. It didn't need framing. It didn't need editing. It just needed to be seen. And within hours, it had been seen everywhere. In a sun-drenched church in Milwaukee, a black pastor pulled up the clip during Bible study and pressed pause right after Jasmine said, "If you're afraid of a necklace, maybe it's not the symbol that's threatening." He turned to his congregation, middle-aged mothers, deacons with lined faces, teenagers still in their Sunday school polos, and said, "That's what it looks like to walk into fire with grace." In Kansas City, a retired Vietnam veteran, grizzled, gray-haired, quiet, shared the video on his Facebook page with just 5 words. "We fought for this dignity." In Atlanta, an immigration rights organizer reposted the moment with a caption that read, "Sometimes justice wears heels and a cross." And in a classroom in Phoenix, Arizona, a high school civics teacher, tired, underpaid, and still fiercely idealistic, played the clip for her half-asleep juniors. Most didn't look up at first. Phones buzzed in laps, heads rested in palms. But about 20 seconds in, the room shifted. Eyes began to rise. One student, a quiet girl who hadn't spoken all semester, leaned forward, mouthing the words silently as Jasmine said them. When the clip ended, the teacher stood at the front of the room and asked, "What do you think she meant? Faith and law aren't enemies." No one spoke at first. Then the quiet girl raised her hand and said, "It means you don't have to stop believing in something just to defend it the right way." That comment would stay with the teacher for weeks. The clip continued to spread, not because it was viral, but because it was vital. People didn't share it for entertainment. They shared it for affirmation, for reassurance, for the reminder that the courtroom wasn't just a place of arguments and rulings. It could be a sanctuary, a place where faith didn't need to hide under reason, but could walk beside it, visible and proud. News outlets tried to frame the story in politics. Congresswoman challenges dress code, religion meets rulebook. But none of those headlines captured what was truly happening. This wasn't about Jasmine challenging the law. It was about her completing it, reminding a nation that the Constitution is not a sterile document, but a living one, that the right to believe and the right to be seen are not in conflict, but in concert. And all of that began not with a podium speech, not with a campaign rally, but with a woman walking into a room she wasn't invited to, wearing a cross that no one expected to see, and refusing, quietly but firmly, to take it off. The tension in the room had thickened, as if each sentence Jasmine spoke added a new layer of pressure. But she didn't rush. She didn't stall. She moved through her presentation like someone walking a tightrope she had built herself. Balanced, assured, and impossibly steady. The jury was no longer just watching her. They were with her. The shift had become visible in their posture, their attention, the way they leaned forward as if afraid to miss a single syllable. Her words didn't need embellishment. They carried the clean weight of conviction. But Sturgis wasn't finished. He stood abruptly, his voice sharper than before, cutting through her momentum like a blade dulled by frustration. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, gesturing pointedly. "She's editorializing again, turning this into a sermon instead of presenting facts." His tone tried to remain polished, but the irritation was bleeding through, betraying the cracks behind his composure. For a moment, the courtroom held still, bracing for the usual correction, but it didn't come. Judge Driscoll didn't even look at Jasmine. Instead, his eyes flicked to Sturgis with something closer to impatience than fairness. "Overruled," he said curtly, tapping the tip of his pen once on the bench. "She's presenting argument in closing remarks. Sit down, Mr. Sturgis." The room didn't cheer, but it didn't need to. The absence of objection was its own form of applause. Sturgis hesitated, then returned to his seat, adjusting his tie, not because it needed fixing, but because he needed something, anything to do with his hands. Jasmine didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply turned back to the jury and let the moment breathe before continuing, her voice calm, almost gentle. "We're not here to make headlines," she said. "We're here to stop history from repeating itself." The words landed without flourish, but they reverberated with power. And it wasn't the kind of line crafted for social media. It wasn't designed to trend. It was designed to remind, to pierce through the decades of doubt and distraction that had buried cases like Cecil Monroe's in bureaucratic language and legal red tape. She paused, looked to Monroe, who had been watching her like a man staring at a lighthouse through storm and fog. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. "Thank you for seeing me." Then Jasmine turned back to the screen behind her, not to add more evidence, but to let what had already been said stand tall and clear. "We've seen this story before," she said quietly. "Too many times. Different names, different prisons, different bruises, but the same silence afterward, the same lack of accountability, the same closing of the book before the last chapter's been written." She looked each juror in the eye. "Today, you get to write the last chapter." The gallery was still. Even the light filtering through the courtroom windows seemed muted, as if the room itself had drawn closer to listen. Judge Driscoll leaned slightly back, but his eyes remained fixed on Jasmine, less as a judge now, and more as a man watching something he hadn't expected to feel again. Belief. She returned to her seat, gathered her papers slowly, and let her hand rest lightly on the folder. Her shoulders relaxed, not because the pressure had passed, but because she had carried it with grace. And now it belonged, for the first time, to someone else, the jury. The storm had not yet broken, but it was close. The jury had exited the room exactly 6 minutes ago, but it already felt like 60. The door they'd slipped through now stood closed and unmoving, an unassuming slab of polished oak that suddenly carried the weight of someone's future, someone's truth. The courtroom, once filled with voices and objections and footfalls, had fallen into the kind of silence that didn't feel respectful. It felt suspended. No one whispered. No one shifted. Even the light filtering through the blinds seemed softer, as if time itself had bent down to hold its breath. Jasmine sat still, her notes neatly stacked, her hands folded calmly on top. She wasn't watching the door. She wasn't fidgeting. But beneath the surface of her composure, a quiet storm churned. She had poured everything into the past 2 hours, every case law, every diagram, every inherited memory stitched into that cross on her chest. Now, like every trial she had ever fought for someone unseen, it was out of her hands. Across from her, Cecil Monroe sat quietly, his posture tight but his expression unreadable. His suit was simple, his shoulders slightly hunched. There were no visible tears, no sighs, no fidgeting. But the way he clasped his hands together, like he was holding on to something invisible, betrayed the tremor underneath. His breathing was shallow, as though every inhale was borrowed and every exhale came with a cost. A flicker of a memory crossed his mind, uninvited but vivid. The moment the prison door opened that night without warning, the sound of boots on concrete, the blur of fluorescent light slicing across the bunk. No questions, no orders, just hands, rough and fast, yanking him from the bed. The thud of his shoulder hitting the wall, the handcuffs biting into skin that had never resisted. And then, after the chaos, the quiet, the terrifying, unnatural quiet that filled the cell as he lay on the floor, trying to count his ribs by the way they ached. Another flash, the nurse's face, blank, clinical, tired, the clipboard, the pen hovering over the signature line like it was just another box to check. He had tried to speak that day, to say something, anything, but the words hadn't come, just pain and silence. Now, years later, he sat in another room, in another silence, waiting to see if any of that suffering had finally been heard. He glanced at Jasmine. Her gaze was forward, her shoulders straight. He leaned in slightly, voice barely more than breath. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "thank you." He glanced at Jasmine. Her gaze was forward, her shoulders straight. He leaned in slightly, voice barely more than breath. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "thank you." She didn't look at him immediately, but her hand moved, just a few inches, and rested on the table near his. Not a touch, not a gesture meant to comfort, just presence, steady, quiet presence. At the back of the courtroom, a reporter's pen hovered over her pad, frozen mid-sentence. The court clerk's fingers danced nervously across the edge of the verdict envelope, still waiting for use. The judge rubbed his thumb along the grain of his gavel, as if unsure when it would next strike. And the bailiff, usually stern and immovable, stood just a bit closer to the bench than usual, like something sacred might happen at any moment, and he didn't want to miss it. Outside, the world kept spinning. Cars rolled by, cell phones buzzed, news tickers updated without pause. But inside that room, nothing moved. Because sometimes justice is not a declaration. Sometimes it's a breath, held by everyone, together, waiting to see if the truth has finally found a place to land. The door opened quietly, almost too gently for what it carried. The jury returned in a single line, each face etched with the kind of stillness that only comes from having touched something fragile and true. Not one of them looked away as they entered. Not from the judge, not from Monroe, and not from Jasmine, who watched them with calm eyes and an unreadable expression. They filed back into the box, and the room, as if responding to a signal only it could hear, rose in attention and tension alike. It was time. Judge Driscoll nodded toward the foreperson, a woman in her 50s with silvered hair and eyes that had not blinked once during testimony. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk stepped forward and took the sealed envelope, slicing it open with careful fingers. There was no drama, no drawn-out pause, just a sheet of paper and a voice that steadied itself before it spoke. "In the matter of Monroe versus Ashland Correctional, on the count of use of excessive force in violation of the Eighth Amendment, we find in favor of the plaintiff." There was a pause, just long enough for air to rush back into the lungs of every person holding it. "And we award damages in the amount of $285,000. There it was. Not a shout, not an eruption, but the kind of audible gasp that sounds more like release than surprise. A woman in the back covered her mouth. One of the reporters whispered, "They actually did it." Another just closed her eyes, let the verdict wash over her like rain after a drought. At the plaintiff's table, Monroe didn't move at first. His fingers remained locked together. His shoulders held their tension. But then, slowly, his back rose as he took in the deepest breath he had taken in years. Not because he had forgotten how to breathe, but because for the first time in too long, the air finally felt like it belonged to him. He didn't cry, not in the way people expected. No tears spilled, no dramatic sighs. But there was something in his face that shifted, something old and heavy loosening in his jaw, his brow, his chest. A man who had carried silence like a second skin now found himself standing in a room that had just said, "We believe you." Jasmine didn't react with celebration. She didn't smile, didn't close her folder with a flourish, didn't turn to the gallery. Instead, she simply placed a hand on Monroe's shoulder, firm, steady, respectful. It wasn't a victory gesture. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet transmission of understanding that said, You were never invisible to me, and now you're not invisible to them either. Judge Driscoll tapped his gavel once. Court is adjourned, he said, though the words felt ceremonial more than authoritative now. The room remained still for a moment longer, not because of protocol, but because no one wanted to be the first to break the silence that followed justice. As the jurors stood to leave, several glanced back toward Jasmine, not out of obligation, but gratitude. She met their eyes, nodded once, then gathered her things without hurry. She moved like someone who hadn't come to win, but to make something right, and had done exactly that. No applause followed her from the courtroom, only respect. And in a world often hungry for spectacle, this was something rarer. This was dignity. As the courtroom emptied, the swell of human movement resumed like a tide finding its rhythm again. Jurors filed out with hushed nods. Reporters typed frantically, the clack of keys replacing the silence that had reigned only moments earlier. The gallery rose in slow waves, some still lingering, reluctant to leave the space where something rare had just happened. Jasmine moved with quiet precision, gathering her things, her motions unhurried. She had no intention of lingering for cameras or interviews. The work was done, and the weight of it still hung on her shoulders, not heavy, but grounding. Then came the voice. Miss Crockett. She turned. It wasn't loud, but it carried the unmistakable tone of someone not used to repeating himself. Judge Driscoll had stepped down from the bench, a rare move for someone as bound to formality as he was. He stood near the clerk's table, one hand resting on the edge like he needed something solid to hold on to. Jasmine paused. The courtroom doors had opened behind her, letting in the first hints of hallway chaos, microphones clicking, camera shutters firing, voices beginning to rise. But inside it was still. I reviewed the fine I issued this morning, he began, his voice low, measured, not quite formal, but not casual either. Jasmine said nothing, only watched him with the same patience she had shown all morning. It wasn't about the cross, he continued after a pause. Not really. His eyes lowered for a second, as if the admission required him to look somewhere safer than her face. It was about control, about me trying to hold the room the way I've always held it, and I didn't expect to be challenged, especially not by someone who came in just to observe. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, not in judgment, but with the careful attention of someone trained to hear the truth between words. I was wrong, he said, finally meeting her eyes. I've signed the dismissal. The fine has been rescinded. She still didn't speak, not out of pride, not out of protest, but because she understood the power of letting a man arrive at his own reckoning without interruption. Driscoll cleared his throat, softened just slightly. You were the sharpest lawyer in the room today, he said, voice tinged with something between apology and admiration, even when you weren't supposed to be in it. Jasmine gave a soft, nearly imperceptible smile. I didn't come here to prove anything, she said, her tone even, not defensive. I know, he replied. That's what made it work. She nodded once, a gesture that held both gratitude and closure. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit, toward the light now spilling in through the open doors. But what waited outside wasn't quiet. The corridor had erupted into a wall of flashing lights, outstretched microphones, and rapid-fire questions hurled with the desperation of those who had arrived too late to witness the story and were now trying to chase it down. But Jasmine didn't hurry. She didn't wave or speak or slow for the press. She moved through the crowd like water, steady, calm, and untouchable. The cross still rested against her collarbone, as visible as ever, but no longer the object of punishment. It had become, quietly and irreversibly, a symbol of presence, of resistance, of grace. And somewhere behind her, still standing beside the empty bench, Judge Driscoll remained. No longer the center of the room, but perhaps for the first time, truly listening to it. The courtroom had emptied, the judgment entered into record, and the cross returned quietly to Jasmine's collarbone. But the moment hadn't ended. It had only just begun. In the digital age, justice doesn't stop at the courtroom doors. It spills outward, repackaged by pixels, reshaped by headlines, reborn in sound bites. And somewhere near the back of the courtroom that day, seated 3 rows behind the gallery rail, a young legal clerk had quietly pressed record. The phone wasn't steady, the frame wasn't professional, but it caught what mattered, It caught Jasmine Crockett standing with stillness, touching the gold cross against her chest and saying in a voice as calm as it was cutting, "If you're afraid of a necklace, maybe it's not the symbol that's threatening." 57 seconds. That's all it took. The clip surfaced online within hours, first on a local legal subreddit, then on a civics teacher's Facebook page, then on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, accelerated by the invisible math of outrage and admiration. By nightfall, it had been seen by over 3 million people. It wasn't polished. It didn't need to be. It was raw. It was real. And it struck a nerve the country didn't know it had left exposed. Teachers played it in class the next morning. In Charleston, a high school senior paused it mid-frame and asked, "Can judges really fine you for something like that?" In Oakland, a history teacher added it to a lecture on the First Amendment. One school district in Detroit sent it out in a newsletter titled "Civic Courage in Real Time." Churches replayed it during Sunday service. In Baltimore, a reverend stood at the pulpit. The clip paused behind him on a projector, Jasmine's hand mid-gesture toward her necklace. "This is what faith looks like when it walks into institutions built to ignore it," he said. "This is not noise. This is scripture lived." The congregation, silent at first, rose to its feet in quiet affirmation. Veterans shared it too. In Houston, an older man with deep creases in his skin and a Purple Heart on his wall posted the video with just 5 words, "She spoke for us all." The post gathered hundreds of comments from others like him, men who had worn uniforms, survived silence, and recognized a different kind of battlefield in Jasmine's voice. The media moved quickly. Headlines were hungry. "Crossfire in court. Silver tongue and gold cross. Congresswoman defies dress code. Delivers justice." But none of them quite captured what people actually felt. Because what moved across the internet that night wasn't outrage. It wasn't partisan fuel. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the feeling that maybe for once, someone had said what needed to be said, in the place it most needed saying. Jasmine didn't post the clip. She didn't retweet it. She didn't issue a statement or capitalize on the wave. She returned to Congress, attended briefings, read memos, and wore the same necklace through every committee hearing. But across the country, people carried her words like a banner stitched into the folds of their daily lives. In elevators and lunchrooms and long text threads, people quoted that one sentence, passed it along like a psalm. "If you're afraid of a necklace." And so a moment, born in the stillness of a courtroom, slipped through screens and speakers and sanctuary walls, and became something bigger than any verdict could contain. Not a hashtag, not a headline, a seed. In the days that followed, the internet continued to churn. Videos rise and fall in digital spaces with dizzying speed. 15 seconds of fame, 24 hours of headlines, 72 hours of noise. But this time, something lingered. The clip of Jasmine Crockett hadn't gone viral because of shock value or stage confrontation. It stayed because it meant something. And meaning in a fractured world is a rare currency. People weren't just watching it. They were reflecting through it, projecting onto it, sharing it not to be seen, but to say quietly, "This is what I've been trying to explain." Comment sections became quiet forums of reverence. "My grandmother wore a Star of David under her blouse during the McCarthy years," wrote one woman. "She said it kept her brave in rooms that didn't want her voice." Another wrote, "As a Sikh man, I've been told to remove my turban in airports. Jasmine, thank you for not removing yours in court." And then simply, she didn't just defend a man. She defended a nation's conscience. Veterans, many of them rarely vocal online, shared the clip without hashtags, without commentary. Just the video and a nod to what it meant. That the principles they once risked everything for still had defenders, not in uniform, but in black blazers and courtroom stillness. In one widely shared post, a former Marine wrote, "She made me believe in oaths again." Young girls, especially black and brown ones, found the clip on platforms their parents barely understood. And they messaged Jasmine's office in a digital chorus of wide-eyed defiance. "I want to be like you. Do I have to go to law school to be that brave? I didn't know we could wear our story around our neck." Their voices were full of awe, But beneath the admiration lives something more powerful: permission. Permission to be seen, to take up space, to speak truth wrapped in heritage, and not shrink when the world demanded compromise. Even civics discourse, usually reserved for dry syllabi and unengaged debates, felt a pulse. University forums used the clip to explore the boundaries between First Amendment rights and courtroom decorum. Legal journals invited op-eds. A professor at Howard Law called it a masterclass in constitutional fluency and cultural fluency, delivered without raising her voice. But beyond the analysis and academic inquiry, something more human stirred: memory. Jasmine hadn't just quoted law, she'd embodied legacy. In refusing to remove her necklace, she didn't challenge tradition. She illuminated it. She reminded the nation that symbols matter not because of what they say, but because of what they remember. Her gold cross wasn't an ornament. It was testimony, worn for every grandmother who couldn't testify, every mother who wasn't believed, every girl told to be quiet and be careful when she should have been taught to be bold. And this quiet, unstoppable resonance is what made Jasmine more than a headline, more than a meme. She became a mirror, and in that reflection, people saw not just her strength, but their own, long buried beneath protocol and politeness, now rising like breath after holding it too long. Leadership, true leadership, isn't about commanding the room. It's about reminding people what they've always known but were afraid to believe. Jasmine did that, not with volume, but with memory, not with force, but with form. She didn't break the rules to make a point. She stood so firmly inside her truth that the rules bent toward her without even realizing it. And across the country, people stood a little taller. Not because they were told to, but because they remembered they could. The courthouse steps had become a battleground of their own. Reporters elbowing for position, camera crews jockeying for clean frames, audio engineers thrusting microphones over shoulders, each one hoping to grab the headline, the quote, the moment. Flashes fired in rapid succession, catching flecks of sunlight against marble columns. Questions rained down like a storm. Congresswoman Crockett, did you expect this verdict? Are you going to file a motion for broader review? Was the judge's fine about your cross, or about who you are? Every voice competed to be heard, every lens searched for the reaction, the soundbite, the spark. But Jasmine wasn't there. By the time most of them had set up their shots, she was already gone, her black blazer blending into the bustle of downtown as she moved away from the noise with a deliberate quiet. No entourage, no statement, no prepared remarks typed on a phone. Just her notebook tucked under one arm, the cross still gently brushing the collar of her shirt, and footsteps that led not toward a podium, but toward a little bookstore tucked beside a coffee shop at the corner of Commerce and Griffin. It wasn't a grand building, just brick, slightly faded, with a bell above the door that gave a soft chime when she entered. The lighting inside was warm, the kind that made every spine on the shelf feel like an invitation. There were no whispers here, no flashes, no interruptions, just the scent of old pages and the soft turning of a newspaper by the man behind the counter. She moved with intention, not browsing but seeking. Her fingers glided along the shelves until they found it. Worn blue cover, slightly frayed edges, gold serif lettering barely holding onto the spine. Gideon's Trumpet. She pulled it down with both hands, the weight familiar. A book about one man's fight for the right to counsel. About the U.S. Supreme Court acknowledging that even the poor and forgotten deserved a voice in their defense. She had read it years ago, back when the law was still theory, and her hands trembled holding casebooks. But today it felt different. Today it felt like a companion. She carried it to the front and laid it gently on the counter. The clerk, a woman in her 20s with ink-smudged fingers, glanced up and blinked. "Wait," she said, her voice cautious, curious. Are you the woman from the courtroom video?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. She offered a soft smile, the kind that carried both pride and restraint. "No," she said just above a whisper. "I'm just someone who loves the Constitution." The clerk nodded almost reverently, rang up the book, and handed it to her in a plain paper bag. Jasmine thanked her, stepped outside, and turned right without pause, disappearing into the swirl of sidewalk traffic as naturally as she had entered. She didn't look back, and though no cameras followed her down that block and no headline captured that moment, it was the one that mattered most. Because while the world was busy trying to define her legacy, Jasmine had already chosen hers: a quiet commitment, a lifelong study, a refusal to let the law become untethered from the people it was meant to protect. No declarations, no drama, just one more page, one more case, one more life defended with dignity. And as the crowd around the courthouse swelled louder with speculation, she walked away in peace, because the work was never about being seen. It was always about being true. Capitol Hill was loud in all the usual ways: the echo of polished shoes down marbled hallways, the clink of coffee mugs in early morning briefings, the whisper of aides coordinating behind closed doors, and the constant low buzz of government in motion. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett walked as she always had: deliberate, steady, unfazed. No special treatment, no grand retelling, no speech prepared for the floor recounting her courtroom stand. The news cycle had already spun to newer scandals, louder controversies, fleeting attention. She led it. She never once brought it up. There were no viral tweets, no victory lap, no op-ed in the Sunday paper. Instead, Jasmine resumed her work: committee hearings on housing inequality, late-night prep on prison reform language, and closed-door negotiations on juvenile justice funding. But if you looked closely, something had changed, or rather, something had remained. Each time she entered a chamber, each time she took her seat at the long mahogany tables of oversight committees or subcommittees on constitutional law, the gold cross glinted subtly beneath her lapel, visible but never loud. It was always there. Some noticed, most didn't, but those who did never forgot it. At one judiciary session, a junior staffer from another office, fresh out of law school with nervous fingers and a voice that cracked when speaking to members, approached her in the hallway. "Ma'am," he said, fumbling slightly, "I saw the clip." My grandma wore the same kind of cross. Jasmine had smiled gently and nodded once, offering no more than that. It was enough. In another moment, walking into a packed ethics hearing, a senior colleague from across the aisle paused and looked at the pendant for just a second too long, then said nothing. That too was enough. And then one afternoon, as she exited the House chamber, a reporter caught up with her. Young, eager, and smart enough to lower his voice so it didn't sound like a trap. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, jogging slightly to match her pace, "I wanted to ask, after everything, is that necklace now a symbol of defiance?" Jasmine didn't stop walking. She didn't break stride or slow her breath. She just looked at him briefly and answered with a tone as soft as it was definitive. "No," she said, "it's memory." Then she turned the corner and disappeared from sight, leaving the reporter standing there, blinking, unsure whether he had just missed the headline or stumbled into something more important than one. And in that answer, in that single word, was everything. It wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about making a point. It was about honoring what came before her, the generations who were silenced in rooms like these, the voices that never made it into transcripts, the hands that passed down more than wisdom, they passed down resilience. The necklace stayed not to challenge decorum, but to remind her, and anyone paying attention, that history doesn't live in books alone. It lives in people. It lives in symbols. It lives in the quiet choices we make every day to remember who we are and where we come from. Jasmine wore the cross like she wore her name, her purpose, her discipline. Not for show, but for truth. She didn't need to explain it. She had already lived it. And the halls she walked now, bright with ambition, echoing with debate, would never quite see her the same way again. The moment Jasmine touched the cross and spoke those few words didn't just ripple through law schools and newsrooms. It reached somewhere far more quiet, far more personal, in homes where voices had long been softened out of habit, in break rooms where employees had learned to look down when confronted, in classrooms where a raised hand always came second to self-doubt. Across the country, a montage began to form, not of protest but of recognition. of people who had once been told no, who had once been fined for asking a question too soon, overlooked for speaking a little too loud, silenced for being just a little too visible. In Chicago, a school nurse who had once been reprimanded for wearing a hijab with a silver crescent pin in front of students now sat on her couch watching the clip on her tablet, whispering, "Yes." In Atlanta, a middle-aged black man recalled the time he was told to remove his kufi at a courthouse security checkpoint or be denied entry. He forwarded the video to his daughter, adding only, "We're not alone anymore." In a tiny law office in New Mexico, a young Navajo attorney who'd been mocked in law school for her turquoise jewelry pinned the clip to the top of her firm's webpage with the caption, "Sometimes the best testimony is to show up with your truth and stay seated in your power." But it wasn't just the public watching. It was the forgotten, the dismissed, the women who had been told to smile more during board meetings, the trans teenager who'd been sent home for dress code violations while wearing clothes that simply matched who they were, the Latino father who had watched a courtroom interpreter misquote his wife's plea and knew better than to interrupt. Each of them saw something in Jasmine, not because she shouted, but because she didn't. She just sat, and in sitting, unapologetically, visibly grounded, she gave others permission to stand. And Jasmine, though she didn't often speak of it, knew this terrain well. She had walked through it for years. The microaggressions came like drizzle. Never a storm, never enough to warrant alarm, but persistent. The time a senior colleague assumed she was the court stenographer. The moment a security guard asked her to wait outside while male interns walked past unchecked. The comments about her tone, her hair, her passion, always wrapped in polite concern, but dripping with the suggestion that she was too much of something and not enough of something else. But she never let it shrink her. She remembered being told in her first internship not to wear hoop earrings to the courthouse because they send the wrong message. She wore them anyway, not because she was trying to provoke, but because they belonged to her, like her name, like her cadence, like her quiet, burning insistence that identity was not a liability. It was an asset, an inheritance, a strategy. That's why when Jasmine walked into that courtroom and refused to remove her grandmother's necklace, she wasn't challenging the rules. She was reminding the room that some stories don't fit inside the rules. Some stories are the reason the rules must change. And for everyone watching, for those who had once been told they were too much, or not enough, or not allowed at all, that reminder was not just overdue, it was sacred. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine's name would be spoken in the committee chambers and whispered in classrooms. Her cross would become a symbol etched into drawings, stitched into banners, held up during local hearings, in quiet protests that didn't seek to disrupt, but to remind. But for her, there was no desire to become myth. No need for marble or monument, because she understood something that too many in power forget. Change doesn't always come roaring through the front door. Sometimes it simply sits still long enough for the room to finally notice it never left. She had spoken when it mattered, and in doing so, she had realigned something. Not just in the case, not just in the courtroom, but in the consciousness of those who had watched, listened, and remembered. It's easy to think that law belongs to the loudest voice, to believe that power is measured in volume, in confrontation, in dominance. But Jasmine knew better. She knew that law isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who knows when to speak, about who listens long enough to hear what isn't being said, about who waits, not in silence but in presence, until the moment comes, and then doesn't hesitate to meet it. The truth is, justice doesn't always arrive in a swell of music or in the slam of a gavel. Sometimes it comes in the weight of a breath before a sentence. Sometimes in the way a person refuses to be moved, not by aggression, but by clarity. Jasmine Crockett didn't win by overpowering anyone. She won by belonging fully, unapologetically, in every space they tried to tell her she couldn't exist in. And now the question lingers, not in her story, but in ours. Where are you being called to stand? Not perform, not posture, just stand. Where are you being asked by the moment, by the history that lives inside you, to speak, not shout, not rehearse, just speak? And where are you, perhaps without even realizing it, being invited to simply stay, to not retreat, not conform, not shrink, but to occupy your truth with stillness so full of intention that it commands the air around it. Because someone out there, maybe a student, maybe a stranger, maybe a version of yourself that you've almost forgotten, is watching. And they need to see it. Not a performance, not a podium. They need to see what it looks like when courage doesn't come dressed as spectacle, but as patience. When resistance isn't noise, but memory. When leadership isn't about changing everything in a day, but about changing the temperature of the room, one breath at a time. So as the echo of Jasmine's footsteps fades beyond the courthouse steps, and the world inevitably moves on to its next headline, don't let this moment slip quietly into the archive. Let it live. Let it challenge you. Let it ask, where will you be when it's your turn to stay seated in truth and still change the room? And as the sound of her footsteps faded into the noise of the world, something quieter remained, something more enduring than applause or headlines. It was the memory of a moment where truth stood taller than protocol, where silence carried more power than noise, and where a woman reminded us that integrity is not a performance, but a posture. Jasmine didn't rewrite the law. She simply reminded it of its purpose. In a society so quick to reward volume, spectacle, and performance, she chose none of those. Instead, she chose clarity over cleverness, stillness over showmanship, and memory over approval. And in doing so, she became more than a lawyer, more than a congresswoman, more than a fleeting media moment. She became a reflection of every person who's ever been told they didn't belong and chose to stay anyway. This story isn't just about a courtroom. It's about every room that has tried to measure a person's worth by how well they blend in. It's about every desk where a woman sat doubting her voice, every hallway where someone hesitated to speak, every dinner table where truth was swallowed to keep peace. Jasmine Crockett showed us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stay visible, to carry your history with you, not hidden, not explained, but honored. What she wore around her neck wasn't rebellion, it was remembrance. A quiet vow passed through generations that said, I am here, and I remember who came before me. Let this not be just a story we revisit for inspiration, but one we return to as instruction. Let it challenge the way we respond when the room grows tense, when our beliefs are questioned, when our presence is inconvenient. Not every battle needs to be loud to be righteous. Not every stand needs a stage to be powerful. And though this story has been shaped, retold, and reimagined here, its essence remains unchanged, a testimony to how law, when held by hands that remember, can serve not only justice, but also truth. So the next time you find yourself shrinking, questioned, or unseen, remember her. Remember the necklace. Remember the silence she turned into strength. And above all, remember this. You don't have to raise your voice to change the room. You just have to carry your truth and never put it down. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive.